Open up your Bibles with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll begin at verse 23, where we'll continue our study of the book of 1 Corinthians. As you'll note in this particular passage, the Apostle Paul says that we should restrict our freedom so that we may please or encourage all men or mankind, and ultimately with the hope that we will be able to lead them to Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul today will address the subject of idolatry again, as he has in several chapters in 1 Corinthians. Now, for us in Western culture, in the United States, idolatry, in the sense of worshiping handmade objects, worshiping in temples that supposedly contain an object in which the idol, the demon, the false god dwells, is not something that we are particularly confronted with. In American culture, our idolatry, as defined in the New Testament, is generally speaking greed or covetousness. Colossians chapter 3, verse 5 says that greed and covetousness amount to idolatry. But in the ancient Near Eastern world, when gods were plentiful in the Greco-Roman culture and throughout history, the worship of idols was a tremendous problem. A few weeks ago, Byron Stuckey, whom you know, Byron and Becky in our congregation were missionaries in the Philippines for over 25 years, shared with me about the confrontation and the difficulty of idolatry in the Philippines where they ministered. And it was very insightful as he shared with me how if a person becomes a believer in Jesus Christ and no longer participates in that idolatry, it is, in a sense, upsetting their entire world. For to not participate in the idolatry is to not be a member of the family. It's like, I suppose for us, you might say, okay, you can no longer celebrate Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter and all the holidays with your family, because their holidays were surrounding the idolatry. And so when you become a believer in Jesus Christ, it's like all of your family holidays are gone. Your family participation is gone. Not only that, but with your neighbors and even your entire community. And to not participate in that idolatry anymore means that you've separated yourself, but not only have you separated yourself, but now you can become the scapegoat for everything that goes wrong. Because if something goes wrong in the family, it's, well, you didn't attend the family dinner holiday, and now the gods are angry with us. You didn't attend this or that, and now the gods are angry with us. And the whole community can get upset with you because, well, you're the troublemaker. You're upsetting the gods. And so we see, as the Apostle Paul addresses this issue again of idolatry, that it was a very, very intensely practical confrontation for believers in Jesus Christ who would come out of that idolatry, out of that paganism, out of that whole culture, the business and economics that was all a part of it, and to stand for Jesus Christ. Now, what we're going to have to do today is to look at what this passage meant to them in that day and then draw out the principles for us today, unless you find yourself in a situation where you are confronted with overt idolatry. In 1 Corinthians 10:23, the Apostle Paul sets down a kind of a cliche saying, we believe, that was very common amongst not only the people of Corinth, but probably most of Greco-Roman culture. And they had kind of a saying that went like this: all things are lawful, all things are lawful. In other words, just do it. Have it your way. Don't limit yourself. The Apostle Paul says all things are lawful, and the word lawful doesn't mean in the legal sense as we think of today with criminal law and civil law and all the domestic law and business law. It was more the idea of all things are possible or all things are permitted. You're free. Grab all the gusto. He says, yeah, all things are possible or permitted, but not all things are profitable or beneficial to one's advantage. All things are lawful, possible, or permitted, but not all things edify or build you up. Paul's saying, yeah, you can do your own thing. Yeah, you can grab all the gusto. You only go around once. Go ahead and do it, so on and so forth. But is it good for you? Is it going to build you up? Is it going to be of benefit and positive impact in your life? Now, when I was a teenager, the main question that I asked myself and confronted my parents with was this: well, what's wrong with it? Have you all heard that? Well, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it? What's the problem? What's wrong with it? And that was always my argument. So, the other one was, well, everybody else is doing it. Everybody else is doing it. Well, it's not going to happen to me. I'm the exception. Maybe 999 times out of 1,000, but don't you understand? I'm the exception. What's wrong with it? The Apostle Paul says, you know what? That's the wrong question. What you should be asking is what's right with it. What's right with it? You understand? You don't say to yourself, what's the danger? You say, what's the benefit? What's the value? What's good in it? Not just what's evil or wrong in it. And that's how we have to think in terms of life decisions. Yeah, all things are permitted, but are they really beneficial? Are they to one's advantage? Yeah, all things are permitted, but is this something that's really going to build me up and make me a better believer in Jesus Christ? Clement of Alexandria, looking at this verse, said this: those who take advantage of everything that is lawful rapidly deteriorate into doing what is not lawful. If you live on the ethical moral edge, you're going to cross it at some point. Verse 24, Paul says, let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. And I would put some words in here from the context. Now, let no one selfishly seek only his or her own good. Paul's not saying don't take care of yourself, don't watch out for yourself. He's saying don't be selfish about it. Don't just look out for yourself, but you also ought to look out for that which is good for your neighbor and for your community. It may be lawful, but is it ethical? It may be lawful, but is it moral? It may be lawful, but is it the loving thing to do? And unfortunately, in American society, where we have turned away from community to individual rights, when we have turned to the minority rather than the majority good, we find more and more, particularly in our court decisions, the decision is going for the individual, the court decision is going for the minority, to the detriment of the community and to the detriment of the majority. And people aren't thinking of community anymore and what is good for the community. They're thinking about what is good for me. Let no one selfishly seek only his own good, but that of his neighbor. And that's out of the mouth of Jesus. What is true faith about? Loving God and loving your neighbor. Verse 25. He says, now eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. And we referred to this and mentioned this last week when we come to the communion table. When we come to the communion table, we are sitting down with God. We are having a meal with God. We have invited him into our presence. We are having a time when we are talking with God about our relationship with Him. We are talking about our relationship with each other, and we invite God to the table. In ancient Near Eastern culture, when they sat down in their pagan temples, they were inviting the gods to sit and to eat with them and to meet with them. And so, when a person was converted out of that idolatry, it was very hard for their conscience to separate that food that was in the meat market that had primarily been dedicated to the gods, the false gods, the demonic gods, the gods of this world. It was hard for them to separate that from just consuming a meal, because in their culture it was all so much entwined. The Greek word here, the maskulon, was a kind of a provision market. It specifically focused on the sale of meat and the sale of fish. And these maskulon were most always in very close proximity to the temples and the false gods of the community, because it was very easy for the people to bring their sacrifices to the temple. The priests of the temple would slaughter it, and then, of course, they would sell it off to the meat market for the people to have. And so there were some meat markets that were not associated with the temple, but most of them were, and chances are you could get your best price around the marketplace of the temple. Also, the maskulon, very often, as you would, in a sense, let's say, walk down the grocery aisle, off to the side would be a little temple, a little chapel. Off to the side would be a temple, a little chapel. So that if you wanted to take your meat and make sure that it had been blessed by the god or blessed by the idol, you could slip in, have a quick service, and be on your way. And that bothered the people. It bothered their conscience. Paul said to them, look, there is no such thing as an idol. There is no such thing as false gods. Yes, there are demons and minions of Satan's henchmen behind it, but it doesn't impact the meat. But it was hard for them to separate this. So he says, look, eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. And then he quotes a psalm in verse 26. He says, for the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. He is quoting from Psalm chapter 24 and the very first verse, a psalm of David. The earth is the Lord and all it contains, the world and all that dwell in it. So the Apostle Paul is basically saying to them, look, it may be sacrificed to false dead idols, but you need to understand this theology. Everything in the world belongs to God. Everyone in the world belongs to God. Not everyone in the world belongs to Jesus, but everyone does belong to God. And the fact that everything belongs to God and comes from God means that everything on earth has a good, righteous, wholesome, and godly purpose. And the perversion of those good, godly, wholesome things is the impact of sin. And so anything on this earth has a positive, beneficial value. So he says, look, don't worry about it if it comes out of the meat market of the idolatrous temple. It belongs to the Lord, and there's nothing wrong with it. Verse 27, he says, if one of the unbelievers invites you, and you want to go, then eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. So if a non-Christian invites you over for dinner, they say, just go ahead and eat it. Don't say to them, by the way, what meat market did you get that in? Is that a kosher market? You know? And of course, for Jews and Gentiles coming to faith in Jesus Christ, and Jews having kosher laws and Gentiles not, this would have been some difficulty in the problem of having fellowship with one another. Now, for instance, the Old Testament forbids eating of certain kinds of shellfish. But the lobster that the Dyklas are going to provide this evening I've already given a blessing over it, reserved some for myself and some steak to make sure that there's nothing wrong with it for you folks. I'm not going to risk your good welfare without me checking it out first, right? That's what a shepherd's supposed to do. But in the Old Testament, they'd have to say, where did this come from? Where did you buy this? How was this prepared? So on and so on. There'd be all these little stipulations that would go on. And Paul says, shut up and eat. What's before you? Verse 28. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, unclean, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. So if you're sitting down to eat at a meal and somebody raises the objection, don't you know that's meat offered to idols? It's not kosher, it's not clean. Then the Apostle Paul says, you know what? You got to back away. Now, maybe that's somebody who was at the dinner invited with you. Maybe that's somebody who, and they had more open-air houses and kind of picnic barbecues, and maybe it was somebody passing by and saw it. But Paul says if somebody raises that objection, then you've got to be sensitive to their conscience. Notice what he says in verse 29. I mean not your own conscience, but the other man's conscience. And then he raises the question, for why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? You've got to be sensitive to what other people think about what you're doing. Because in some ways it's very precedent setting. And this is something that I think I'm very attuned to and that we need to be attuned to. You need to be aware of the fact that with every decision you make, you are very often setting a precedent. You are setting a principle. And believe me, our kids will recognize the exceptions to the precedent right away. And they will want to set a new precedent if they don't like the old one. With every decision we make, we have to think about what is the long-term impact. And of course, the long-term impact of being insensitive to somebody can be very detrimental. It may be an unbeliever who's just testing you and wanting to find out, hey, where is your faith? Where is your honesty? Where is your integrity? And they will call you out, just trying to test you. Sometimes it could be, again, just another guest that was invited, and you have to try to be sensitive to how they feel. Paul says, for why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? And that's a legitimate question. Hey, why should I be limited because of somebody else's weak conscience? Why should I be limited because of somebody else's ignorance? Why should I have to restrict myself because they have a problem when the Lord doesn't have a problem with it? And he says in verse 30, if I partake with thankfulness, then why am I slandered or spoken wrongly of concerning that for which I give thanks? I mean, the bottom line of the New Testament is if you receive something and you give thanks for it and you consume it, then it's perfectly fine and you shouldn't be criticized. But the fact is we can be. And so Paul is understanding the feelings of the people. I shouldn't be criticized. I shouldn't be held up to scrutiny. I shouldn't be limited in this thing. I should be able to do what I can do, want to do in the Lord, so on and so forth. But then he comes to verse 31. And he says, whether then you eat or you drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. See? Yeah, I have a right to do it. Yeah, I shouldn't be criticized. Yeah, I should have my own way. I'm perfectly within my rights and my theology and everything to go ahead and do it. And so why do I have to limit myself? Because I must seek to glorify God. Because you cannot consciously, intentionally harm others and at the same time glorify God. You can't consciously, intentionally do something that is going to hurt other people and think that you can still glorify God. And then what I would call one of the few poor chapter divisions in the Bible, we need to include 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, with chapter 10. And it says this, "Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ." And that's the end of this section. That's our goal. The what would Jesus do? WWJD. A wonderful principle to ask ourselves in decision making, particularly young people. Ask yourself the question, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? What would Jesus have me to do? And the fact is that we have to, as believers in Jesus Christ, absorb a lot of pain sometimes. We've got to absorb a lot of restrictions. We've got to absorb a lot of humility. We've got to absorb a lot of servanthood in order to be sensitive to other people in our walk of faith. Whether you eat or you drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. The problem that was facing the Corinthians was that what they could do was being criticized by people of weak faith, no faith, weak conscience. And so they had to restrict their liberty in order to be sensitive and to help those who were hurting and those who did not understand the truth of the Lord. Now, how does this apply to us today? How can we make this practical? Well, let me just go through a brief list of some different ideas that I thought about on this. All right. Some years ago, while I was in seminary, I wanted to continue my golf game. But the clubs I had were so old and so crummy that I would have been embarrassed to go out. And I didn't want to buy new ones. And so somebody said to me, "Well, John, there's so many pawn shops around. Why don't you go by the pawn shop and see if you can find something?" And I was also looking for a bike to ride and to get some exercise. So I went into the pawn shop, and I went into the pawn shop. Here was a brand new set of golf clubs. I mean, they still had the wrappers on them. And I wondered to myself, are these stolen? I mean, isn't that a common question? And then I thought, no. Some man probably got it for his birthday, didn't want to take up golf, and he brought them in. And so I began this fight in my conscience. Can I buy them? Can I not buy them? Blah, 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 blah. But the price is so good. Obviously, the Lord has led me here. It's a sale. It must be the Lord's will. Right? How many times have you heard that? I think Paul would say to me, look, don't let your conscience bother you in this. For whatever reason, they're here. I did ask, are they past the time? So on and so forth. Do you know the background of it? The guy simply said, do you want the clubs or not? And I said yes. And so I got them. But, this could be a conscience thing. For some people today, purchasing of clothes can be a real problem because of the quote-unquote sweat factories of our world. Don't buy from this store, don't buy from that store, don't go here, don't go there, because these things have been made in the sweat factories of the world by the children, so on and so forth. That may be something that you legitimately feel that you need to take into account. It's something you need to vote with your monetary dollars. But the other part of it is that you don't have to let your conscience plague you in such a situation. If it's something you want, if it's something affordable, it's not a spiritual decision, I don't think necessarily, even though we need to be compassionate and concerned about the labor practices of the world. How about another one? Maybe investments. There are particular investment accounts that you can get into today that have strong Christian principles and theological bases behind it. They don't invest in alcohol products or tobacco products or certain kinds of health things, or research companies that would research into ethically unacceptable, so on and so forth. And for some people, when they get into investments, their conscience, and that's okay, that's a personal thing for them. If they want to invest in a particular mutual fund or whatever because of its values, but they can't cross over to somebody else and say, well, you know what you're doing is sinful, what you're doing is wrong to invest in such and such a thing that makes such and such a product. I think that that's going beyond the critical conscience. Maybe another example. As a college professor, I found that students liked to hang out with me. They were under some crazy idea that it would help their grade. Never did. But it did seem that the lower the grade, the more they wanted to hang out with me. And of course, back in those days, we couldn't afford, cable to watch the Detroit Red Wings and things like that. And back then, they were the only thing worth watching. And they would say, well, would you like to go out and watch the Red Wings this evening? And of course, part of my answer was yes, but part of my problem was the only place you could go would be like a sports bar. Now, there is nothing wrong with a good burger at a sports bar, I don't think. If you want to talk about these things later, I can. I don't go to sports bars, but if people do, that's between them and the Lord. But for me to take a student, boy, would I hear about it, And you have to be sensitive to those kinds of things. For me personally, it's the environment, it's the whole thing of it, and the Red Wings just aren't that important. But these are personal decisions that people can make. Maybe a couple more. We could talk about video games for children. When you ask the question, all things are possible. Well, there's all kinds of video games out there. But are they beneficial to our children? Are they healthy for our children? What are they teaching our children? Are they so violent that they're being desensitized? We're seeing the statistics or the studies now about children in younger ages that watch too much television and how it can create this kind of deficit disorder and problems. We could talk about movies if we had more time. Just because a movie is PG or PG-13, or just because I'm an adult and legally I can go to an R or whatever more beyond that, that doesn't mean just because it's permitted by law that it's spiritually right and discerning. What would Jesus do? The only R-rated movie that I would recommend these days would be The Passion, because it's the proper rating for an expression of the love of God poured out upon the life of Jesus for you and I. But we should think about these things in areas of even gambling, Recently, Jack Welch, when he retired, I believe it was from General Electric as the CEO, he was going to take with him millions and millions of dollars in bonus. And you got to ask yourself the question, is it legal? But is that best for the community? Is that best for the business world? Is that really right? The Catholic Church has recently gotten after John Kerry. They say, John Kerry, you're not a good Catholic. You're pro-abortion. You're pro-partial birth abortion. You're pro-gay marriage and all these kinds of things. And that doesn't fit into Catholic theology. It doesn't fit into biblical theology. And other people stand up and say, well, wait a minute, you got to separate politics from morality. Well, they did that a long time ago, didn't they? And these are the issues that we find ourselves confronted with in the areas of conscience and criticism that goes on. Paul's point is this: we must restrict our Christian liberty for the good of the individual and for the good of the community. And we need to think in terms of how our lifestyle and our decisions set precedents for the future. Whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. Don't ask what's wrong with this. Ask what's right with this. And be an imitator of Jesus Christ. We're on earth to glorify God. We're on earth to bring people to Christ. We're on earth to set good examples, right examples, safe examples for our children and for our community. And therefore we need to think seriously about our actions and our lifestyle of decisions. Non-believers are going to test you. If you're in the marketplace, in the neighborhood, and you're at work, non-believers are going to test you. They're going to come up sometime and they're going to say, "Oh, you can't do that. You're a Christian." You know? How many golf tournaments I get invited to on Sunday mornings? Unbelievable. And I say to them, "Well, I'm just not interested in golf on Sunday mornings. It's not because I've got a job. It's because I've got this community of faith that I worship with. And this is a time that we set aside to worship the Lord." When I'm, as a father confronted with sports selections for my children, or club selections for my children, or activity selections for my children, I say to myself, what's going to be the precedent-setting principle here? And the precedent-setting principle, I think, of the Scriptures is that we love the Lord our God. And so we excuse ourselves from those conflicts, and we say, you know what? There's something more important in my life, and there's something I want more important in my children's life, and that is for them to understand that we have a great God, and He's to be honored at all times, and that we corporately gather together for worship. And to compromise that is to say this: something else is more important than the Lord God. And we can talk about that more if you'd like. But when two things come into conflict, the one that is chosen becomes the precedent. The exception becomes the real rule. You could be here 20 Sundays and have one conflict. And if that conflict is the thing, in my opinion, and we can talk about this more, that wins out, then that is the real rule. The exception becomes the rule. God wants us, whether we eat or drink, the basic necessities of life, whatever we do, to glorify Him and to be sensitive and caring to our neighbors. Let's